David.
Thank you. I'm Dave Carr, Director of Public Affairs here at the Union League Club. I'd like to thank Committee for Economic Development and Illinois Campaign for Political Reform for bringing this wonderful conversation to this distinguished panel to the club today. And for reasons that have been so very well articulated, this club has long been on record as supporting a system of merit selection for selecting judges. So I think that the arguments for that are very compelling. I wanted to pose a question to the panel regarding the role of contributions to elected officials apart from the judiciary. By way of full disclosure, I spent 15 years working on Capitol Hill for a member of Congress and also managed campaigns for that gentleman. And my question is, when it comes to petition for redress of grievances, it seems to me that there is a context in which, whether it's an individual contribution or contributions bundled through a political action committee or given through a corporation, that's all a manifestation of that petition to redress for right of grievances. My question is, there is always, it seems to me, a kind of a tacit assumption that money flowing into a campaign committee on behalf of an elected official or a candidate might be influencing or buying that candidate's position on a given issue. And I wonder whether you don't think it's equally plausible that the money flows to positions that are already held by those candidates or elected officials. For example, if you have a member of the House of Representatives from West Virginia or from Virginia where there are significant tobacco interests, one would presume that the elected officials from those states, those jurisdictions, would support the interests of the tobacco industry, which are important to that state. Similarly, representatives of agricultural areas where the growing of corn here in Illinois or Iowa and so forth. And so I guess my question is, isn't it equally plausible that the influence of money in the political system is that it flows to reinforce and to sustain the positions that are already held by these candidates rather than somehow influencing them to take positions that they would not otherwise have taken absent that monetary support?
Sure. But again, there are multiple motivations depending on the situation. I think corporations, as with anybody who's interested in a particular issue, is going to want to support the champions in government for that issue if they're elected. So you do tend to support people who are already out there in terms of their positions aligning well with yours. But I think there are other situations. I think, again, just from my experience, a lot of money went to incumbents because they were incumbents, and particularly if they were chairs of committee, because your people in Washington would tell you if you want to have a conversation about something, whether this person's into your issue or not, that you sort of had, it was the price of admission, going back to the point Bill made. And distasteful, you didn't like it, but you did it. So I think it can be simply to be sure that you are in the room and can have a conversation, that the staff will return some of the calls and listen perhaps a little bit more carefully to what you're saying. It doesn't buy their vote, doesn't buy their position, but it gives you an opportunity to argue and to lobby. But you're absolutely right. A lot of the money goes to people who have already demonstrated that they're out front on the issues that are important to you. One other thing I'd mention, going back to Charlie's comment, is the other thing that corporations bring besides money are votes in terms of employees and the communities where they are, dealer networks and things like that. So I think there are a number of ways that corporations can approach an elected official, and an elected official usually is as interested in, do you control any votes? Are you going to influence any votes, as they are in, are you contributing in my campaign?
Sir. Oh, I'm sorry.
Cindy, I'm sorry. If you can hear me, Terry Martin with the Illinois Channel. Let me go, if I might, to the selection of judges, since we focused on that aspect of it for a moment. So in Illinois, we elect judges to the Illinois Supreme Court. In Missouri, we have the Missouri model, where the Missouri Bar, and in some other states, they say, here's a list of qualified individuals, and give that to the governor, and the governor selects from that list. In Iowa, as I understand it, it's more like at the federal level. The governor acts like the president would and just says, here's my choice, and the governor is not limited to a list as in the Missouri model. Which, if any of those, do you prefer?
As the sole representative, to my knowledge, of Missouri and the Missouri nonpartisan court plan, it was adopted in the early 40s in response to the control that Boss Pendergast in Kansas City and a similar boss in St. Louis exercised through the governor's office in picking all the judges. And so the citizens had a referendum statewide, and they decided they wanted the Missouri nonpartisan court plan. It's been tinkered with so that you get more public input, so that it's not done in secret. But it has been a model for many states around the country, and it is consistent with this idea of neutral principles abiding in government to ensure the maintenance of those standards supporting the so-called free market system.
I would like to say that the Chamber has studied this, and in this booklet, which very short but I think a very good summary,
Yes.
Endorses the best practices of the Arizona system, and without getting an extended discussion, it does it because the problem with gubernatorial appointment is that, and the reason we have elections, is that during our history in this country, there was a sense of cronyism. It was political payback to people who were loyal to the governor in elections or whatever. So you got cronyism on the court, which wasn't much better than what we're getting in some states with elections. In Arizona, which has been there for decades now, it's a bipartisan commission. It can only have one more of one party than the other, so it's definitely bipartisan. The majority are non-lawyers, and it's geographically distributed through the state. There are other aspects of this that assure the neutrality of that commission. They're looking at qualities of temperament, judgment, analytical ability, so on and so forth. So the roster that comes up for appointment to the governor only through that commission is at least circumscribed in terms of people who are really very good lawyers and potential jurists. And I think the Arizona model increasingly is one that people are looking to as perhaps having the best elements of a merit selection system.
Good points, Thomas, and I subscribe to the motive and to the expression of these principles in Arizona. Thank you for reminding us of that.
Thank you. Sir?
Thank you. Am I on?
Yeah.
Good. I'd like to go back to Charlie Holt's question and some of the questions that Tom Gottschalk raised about the role of money, corporate money, as a price for access to elected officials. I see some case for that based on my own personal experience, which I'll get to in a moment. I see no case, however, for massive contributions at all in the case of judicial elections, and certainly not corporate contributions. Though I want to address the question more about elected officials, particularly national elected officials. It might be a little different in the state situation. I really don't know. And right now, I'm a professor at the University of Chicago, and my interest is primarily on the rule of law issues in the developing world. But there was a time when I had to work for a living, and I happened to be a senior officer of a large corporation, the IBM company, and that was at a time, just to situate my comments, when IBM was more or less the American computer company. It was the mainframe era. There was a young, interesting company named Apple, but its revenues were not all that great and wasn't a major factor, and certainly we didn't have social media and so forth. So in that context, one of my roles in the company was to deal with the U.S. Congress and in general with the political system. We did not make political contributions. Whether we would have if we felt we had to is another question. We didn't feel we had to. In fact, we could see some disadvantages. And we had no problem with access, but then we were a very large corporation. We had employees in every state. We had a lot of employees in some states because we had plants all around the United States. And that point was made. That is a real come-on for access because people were interested. Elected officials were interested in those employees. So we always brought in the plant manager or whoever was the major representative of the company in that particular state to be part of the conversation and not to be the sole person in the conversation. And we had no problems with access. But what about smaller companies? They really aren't in that position, particularly in seeing congressmen and senators from states in which they really don't have any business, but where the issue before that congressman, that member of the Senate, is very important to their corporate business. I think that a rule which seriously limits, I'm not saying there shouldn't be any limitation, but really seriously limits political contributions by corporations with regard to elected officials will harm smaller companies at least as much or perhaps more than larger companies, particularly those that have a nationwide presence. This is contrary to the popular notion somehow that it's the big corporations that have all that money who will have an unfair advantage. I think that you've got to be careful when you're promulgating rules that you're not actually having the opposite effect of what you may think you're having. And I think this is an area to investigate that possibility.
Comments?
Currently, there are regulations at the federal level where a PAC or an individual has a cap as to how much they can contribute. In regard to corporate money, corporations cannot contribute to individual candidates. Right. In regard to other committees, such as, say, the National Governors Association, the Democratic Governors Association, corporations can contribute. And there were different ways that you could do that in the past. I agree with your point on the smaller entities and how you go up against the larger entities. There are a number of ways you do that. You form trade associations, but there is a concern about sort of the arms race in raising money for elections, and this gets back to the previous question. Members of Congress, governors are spending more and more time raising money when they could certainly put that time to better use. We attempted at the presidential level to publicly finance campaigns, and the sitting president decided not to do that, and he actually was able to raise a considerable amount of money through a new venue, through younger people with electronics. So I'm not sure if putting a limit, certainly the limits to individual members right now is a good idea. And but overall, I don't know if it's enforceable. And quite frankly, I think the people who benefit the most are the fundraisers themselves. And I wonder at times. Actually, I was at a fundraiser, and I said to the member, I said, "When are you guys going to get off this treadmill that you put yourselves on?" And the fundraiser threw a roll across the room at me. But it is a real issue, and it speaks to the quality of life for members. And quite frankly, if you are dedicated to public service, but you don't like the rubber chicken circuit, how long can you last in this circumstance? So it does test people. But the other side of that is very wealthy people. Do we want only the rich running for public office? So there's a balancing act here.